The rain came in sideways off the Bitterroot Range that Friday night. The kind of rain that did not fall so much as lean pressing itself against every window in Harlow, Montana, like it had somewhere it needed to be. Route 12 had been empty for 2 hours. The gas station across from the old feed store had cut its lights at 9. By 10:30, the only thing still open and still lit in the entire town was the Painted Sky Diner, and even its neon sign buzzed and flickered in the wind like it was thinking about giving up. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and pie crust, and the particular kind of warmth that old buildings held onto out of stubbornness rather than insulation. 6 booths ran along the window side. A long counter with 8 stools stretched the length of the back wall. The floor was black and white tile worn pale at the high traffic spots near the register and the coffee pot. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, doing nothing useful, just moving the warm air from one side of the room to the other. Nora Gallagher had owned the Painted Sky for 19 years. She was 52 years old, tall and angular, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical knot, and hands that had seen enough to belong to a woman 20 years older. She had bought the diner the same year her second marriage ended, paid for it with the settlement money, and a stubbornness that surprised even herself, and she had not regretted a single early morning or a single late night since. The diner was hers. The people who came through it were hers. That was enough. On a Friday night in late October, her regulars were sparse. 2 truckers sat at the far end of the counter with their backs to the door, eating in the focused silence of men who had been driving since dawn. A retired school teacher named Harriet Boone occupied her usual booth with a library book and a cup of decaf she nursed like it was the last cup on earth. An older couple near the window split a slice of apple pie without speaking, the comfortable silence of people who had been married long enough that words were optional. And at the near end of the counter, on the second stool from the register, sat Rex Briggs. He was 58 years old, built wide across the shoulders, with the kind of physical density that came not from vanity, but from decades of hard work and harder living. His hair had gone iron gray, cropped short, and his beard was the same color, trimmed close along the jaw that looked like it had been carved from something that did not yield easily. Both forearms were covered in ink, old tattoos faded to the soft blue-green of deep water, the kind of work done in the 80s when biker ink was not art but autobiography. He wore a black thermal shirt under his cut-the leather vest, carrying the patches of Iron Verdict MC on the back, a Montana chapter sergeant-at-arms beneath his name rocker. Rex had been coming to the Painted Sky on Friday nights for 6 years. Not because the food was exceptional, though Nora's pie was worth the drive from anywhere. He came because Friday nights at the Painted Sky were quiet, and quiet was something Rex Briggs had learned to need the way other men needed noise. He ordered the same thing every time. Black coffee, the beef stew if it was on, apple pie after one slice, no ice cream. He did not talk much, nor did not push him to. That was the agreement they had reached without ever discussing it the way honest people sometimes did. He was halfway through his stew when the door opened. The bell above it gave its usual bright sound, and a gust of cold air pushed through before the door swung shut. Rex did not look up immediately. He heard the wet sound of boots on tile, the particular shuffle of someone who was trying not to be noticed. He heard Nora set down the coffee pot. He heard the small sound of a zipper being pulled higher against the cold. Then he looked up. She was standing just inside the door, one hand still on the handle, as if she had not fully committed to being inside yet. She was 39 years old, though she looked older than she probably was, in the way that exhaustion and sustained fear aged a face. Her hair was dark auburn, damp from the rain falling past her shoulders in tangled waves. Her eyes were gray-green and wide, and doing what eyes did when they were checking every corner of a room in the first 3 seconds. She was wearing a canvas jacket, 2 sizes too large jeans, with a tear at the left knee and boots that had been resoled at least once. She carried a single bag, a canvas duffel worn at the handles pressed against her side like a second spine. She was beautiful the way certain things were beautiful after surviving weather. Not delicate, enduring. She did not look at Rex. She looked at the windows first, then the back exit near the kitchen, then the parking lot through the glass, then finally that Nora who had come around the counter with the coffee pot the way she did for everyone who walked in, because that was the policy of the Painted Sky, and it did not have exceptions. "Sit anywhere you like," Nora said. The woman chose the stool beside Rex. Not the stool 2 down, not the booth against the far wall away from the windows. the stool beside the largest, most solid human presence in the room. She did not look at him when she sat. She faced forward, placed her bag between her feet where she could feel it, and put both hands flat on the counter. Her left hand had a faded mark on the ring finger, the pale ghost of a band removed some time ago. Her right hand had a small cut on the knuckle, recent, still pink at the edges. Nora poured her coffee without asking. The woman wrapped both hands around the mug and did not drink. She stared at the surface of the coffee like she was trying to read something in it. Rex returned to his stew. For 4 minutes, nothing happened. The rain hit the windows. The ceiling fan turned. Harriet Boone turned a page in her library book. The truckers discussed road conditions between Missoula and Billings in low, practical voices. The couple with the apple pie asked for the check. Then the woman beside Rex picked up a paper napkin from the dispenser, smoothed it flat on the counter with one careful hand, and wrote something on it with the pen she pulled from her jacket pocket. She wrote in small, controlled letters, the writing of someone who had learned to keep things contained. When she was done, she slid the napkin across the counter. Not to Nora, to Rex. He looked at it. "He is outside. Please do not react." Rex did not react. He read the words once, then again, then set his spoon down with the same unhurried movement he would have used if she had slid him the dessert menu. He did not look at the window. He did not look at the door. He picked up the pen from the counter where she had left it, turned the napkin over, and wrote 4 words. How many exits does he know about? He slid it back. She read it. Her hands tightened briefly on the mug. Then she wrote again. Front only. He does not know I came in here. He followed me from the gas station, but I cut through the alley. His car is on Birch Street, 1 block east. Black SUV. I have maybe 10 minutes before he drives the perimeter again. Rex read it. He folded the napkin once slowly and placed it under the edge of his coffee mug. Then he looked at Nora. Nora was already watching him. She had read nothing. She had heard nothing. But she had been running this diner for 19 years, and she knew the particular geometry of a frightened person sitting next to someone who had just been asked for help. She raised her eyebrows a fraction of an inch. Rex said without inflection, "Is the back door unlocked tonight?" Nora said, "It is always unlocked until midnight." Rex nodded once. He turned back to his stew. He said to the counter, to the air, to no one in particular, "What is your name?" The woman did not answer immediately. She looked at the side of his face, at the tattoos on his forearms, at the patches on his vest, and at the hands that had seen things she could not know about. She looked at him the way people looked when they had heard something they wanted to believe, and were deciding if the wanting itself was dangerous eyes carrying the particular wariness of earned scar tissue rather than simple suspicion. Then she said it quietly. "Sarah." He said, "My name is Rex. I am not going to ask you anything else right now, but I need you to drink that coffee like you came in here for coffee. Can you do that?" She picked up the mug. Her hands were trembling, but the trembling was internal, the kind that did not show much unless you were looking for it. She drank. Rex finished his stew. The minutes passed like something slow and heavy. Sarah kept her eyes forward. Rex kept his eyes on his plate and then on his coffee, and used the peripheral vision he had developed over 30 years of sitting in rooms where he needed to know what was happening at the edges without appearing to care. At the 2-minute mark, he clocked a pair of headlights on the far side of the parking lot, moving slowly, not pulling in, just traveling the perimeter of the block. Black SUV, dark windows, moving at the speed of someone looking without wanting to appear to be looking. He said nothing. At the 4-minute mark, the headlights disappeared east on Birch Street. Sarah exhaled. It was barely audible, but Rex heard it. He said, "Tell me one thing, just one." She turned her head slightly toward him. He said, "Is there someone safe? Somewhere you are trying to get to?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My daughter, she is 7-8 in February. She is staying with a neighbor in Billings. Her name is June. The neighbor is safe, but I cannot call from my number because he tracks it. I have not spoken to June in 4 days." Rex did not move his face, but something behind his ribs shifted, old and familiar and heavy. He said, "We can fix the phone problem." She looked at him, then really looked at him the way people looked when they had been told comforting things that turned out to be untrue so many times that believing had become a skill they had to relearn from scratch. Rex held her gaze. He did not smile. He did not make promises with his face. He just looked back at her the way a man looked when he had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. After a moment, she nodded, small, almost invisible, but there. Nora came around the counter with the coffee pot and refilled both their mugs, and when she set the pot back, she left her hand on the counter for just a second, near Sarah's not touching, just closed the way women sometimes communicated what words would make too large. Sarah looked down at the counter, and her shoulders came down by a fraction of an inch. Rex turned his mug between his palms and thought about what he was doing and decided it was the only thing a man with any conscience left could do. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the way she used to sit in this exact diner 2 stools down and how her eyes had carried something he had been too proud and too certain and too busy to name until it was too late to do anything with the naming. Margaret had asked him once very simply in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday evening when nothing in particular was happening if he thought she was worth protecting. He had said something careless, something that managed the moment rather than met it. He had deflected with a joke and moved on and told himself she was fine, because fine was easier to live with than the alternative. She died knowing he had said the careless thing. He did not get to go back and say the other one. He had spent 11 years since then becoming the man who stayed. It was the only correction available to him now. He was not going to look away tonight. The bell above the door rang. Every head in the painted sky diner came up. Not dramatically, not with the synchronized snap of a film scene, but with the quiet, involuntary attention of people whose instincts had registered something before their minds caught up. The man who walked in was nothing like what a room expected when it tensed. He was perhaps 40, lean and well-groomed, wearing a dark jacket that fit well, his hair combed back neatly, despite the rain, his shoes clean and dry in a way that said he had not been walking in the weather, but arriving from a vehicle, stepping deliberately, caring about appearances, even here. He was handsome in a practiced way, the kind of handsome that came from attention to detail rather than any natural quality. His face was composed into an expression of mild concern, the face of a reasonable man looking for someone he cared about. He paused inside the door and let his eyes move around the room slowly. Not searching, presenting, making sure everyone saw him before he found what he was looking for. His eyes landed on Sarah. Sarah did not run. She did not flinch. Something happened to her posture instead, something that Rex recognized as the body doing the only thing left when there was nowhere to run. It went still and very straight, the way certain animals went still, not from calm, but from the deep biological knowledge that movement would make things worse. The man walked toward the counter, unhurried, certain. He stopped 2 feet behind Sarah and slightly to her left, a position that blocked her easiest path to the door without being close enough to look threatening to anyone who did not know what they were watching. He said in a voice warm enough to fill the whole room, "Sarah, sweetheart, you scared me half to death." He said it to the room as much as to her. He was performing relief and he was good at it. The kind of good that came from practice. Sarah said nothing. Her hands were flat on the counter. Her coffee mug was in front of her. She was looking at the surface of the counter with the fixed focus of a person who was counting heartbeats. Rex did not stand up. He did not turn around. He set his coffee mug down with a small, deliberate sound and said, still facing forward, "She looks fine to me." The room tightened. Not visibly, not loudly, but in the way a room tightened when a line had been drawn and people were deciding which side they were on. The man stopped. He recalculated in the way people did when an obstacle appeared where they had expected empty space. He looked at the back of Rex's head, at the cut at the patches, at the width of the shoulders, at the particular stillness of a man who was not performing calm, but actually felt it. He said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter." Rex picked up his coffee mug. He drank. He set it back down. He said, "I did not ask." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt longer. Harriet Boone had set down her library book. The truckers had both turned slightly on their stools, not aggressively, just the unconscious reorientation of men who had spent time in rooms where things could go sideways. Nora stood behind the register with her hand near the phone. The man said his name was Derek Voss. He said it clearly, like the name itself was supposed to accomplish something, like the syllables carried weight that should be recognized. He said he and Sarah had been going through a difficult time since her mother passed, that Sarah had not been herself, that he had been worried that he had driven a very long way in bad weather to make sure she was safe, that he hoped people could understand that. It was a good speech. It was the speech of a man who had given versions of it before, who had learned which words landed and which ones created friction, who understood that a room full of strangers would default to believing a calm man over a silent woman if the calm man got there first. Nora watched his face while he gave it. She had heard this speech before, not from this man, but from the particular genre of man that this man belonged to. 22 years ago, she had been on the other end of a version of this speech, sitting in a room while someone explained to other people why her fear was a misunderstanding. She knew the rhythm of it. She knew where the warmth was synthetic and where the concern was scaffolding rather than feeling. She picked up the phone. Derek noticed. His eyes moved to her hand. Nora said, "I am going to call the county non-emergency line and have a deputy come out and help you all sort this out. Seems like the right thing to do when there is a family concern." Derek said, "That is not necessary." Nora said, "It is no trouble at all." Derek's mouth tightened for the first time. It was brief, perhaps a quarter of a second, and then the warmth came back. But Rex had seen it. The truckers had seen it. Harriet Boone had seen it. Sarah had not seen it because she was staring at the counter. But she felt the atmosphere of the room change the way you felt, a drop in barometric pressure, the specific quality of air before a storm shifted, and something in her chest unknotted by the smallest possible increment. The smallest possible. But there, Derek said, "Sarah, look at me." She did not look at him. He said soft, reaching for the register that had always worked before honey, "You know, this is not what you want. You know how this looks. You are tired and you are grieving and you are not thinking clearly. And that is okay. That is human. But these people do not know you and they cannot help you the way I can." Sarah's hands tightened on the counter. Rex watched her fingers go pale at the knuckles. He said, still without turning, still facing forward, to no one in particular, "She seems to be thinking pretty clearly to me." Derek looked at him. The look had something in it that most people never saw from a man like Derek Voss, because most people never made Derek Voss feel publicly cornered. It was a look that understood the value of patience and was currently spending it down. He said, "I do not know who you are, but you are inserting yourself into something that does not involve you." Rex turned on his stool then. Slowly, the way large things turned when they were not in a hurry, he looked at Derek Voss with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had looked at harder things and not blinked. He said, "You are right that I do not know you." He paused. "And you do not know me. So let us all wait for the deputy and let the people with badges sort it out. That work for you?" It was not a question. It had the shape of a question and none of the uncertainty. Derek stood very still for a moment. Then he took the stool, 2 seats down from Sarah on the other side, and he sat down and placed his hands on the counter in front of him and smiled at Nora when she came with the coffee pot, because Derek Voss was a man who understood that the game was not over until it was over, and that composure was the field on which he won. Nora poured his coffee and set the pot back and did not return his smile. Outside, the rain continued. The window of the painted sky showed the wet black of the parking lot, the gas station's dark sign across the road, and the empty stretch of Route 12 disappearing into the dark in both directions. Rex turned back to the counter. He reached into the pocket of his coat, found his phone, and set it on the counter in front of Sarah with the screen facing up. He had already opened the keypad. He said quietly, "The neighbor's number. Go ahead." Sarah looked at the phone. She looked at Rex. He was looking at the window. She picked up the phone. Her fingers moved carefully across the screen, dialing from memory, a number she had held in her head for 4 days, like a prayer she was not allowed to say. She held it to her ear. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice answered, cautious and alert at the late hour. Sarah closed her eyes. She said very quietly, "It is me. Is June okay?" Rex watched the line of Sarah's shoulders while she listened to the answer. He watched them come down a full inch as the voice on the other end said what it said. He watched her press her lips together, hard enough to go white, not from pain, but from the specific physical effort of holding back something that had been waiting 4 days to come out. She said, "Tell her mama is okay. Tell her I will come soon." She handed the phone back. Her eyes were wet, but her face was composed. Whatever she was feeling, she was holding in her chest like something too large for the room. Rex put the phone back in his pocket. He said nothing. Two stools down, Derek Voss drank his coffee and watched them in the reflection of the window glass, with eyes that were very calm and very busy at the same time. The bell above the door rang again. Everyone looked. A younger man came in mid-20s wearing a cut that matched Rex's in color, in general construction. Though his was newer and his patches fewer, he was lean and dark-haired with the kind of alertness that came from paying attention to things most people missed. He looked at Rex first, then at the room, then at Derek Voss, then back at Rex with a question in his face. Rex said, "Cole, sit down." Cole Briggs pulled out a stool near the door, sat and accepted the coffee Nora brought him without taking his eyes off the room for longer than it took to nod a thank you. He said to Rex low enough for just the two of them, "There is a second vehicle, parked on the service road behind the feed store. It has been sitting there since before I came in. Two people inside." Rex absorbed this without any change of expression. Derek Voss was still looking at the window. Rex wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and thought about the geometry of the room, the exits, the camera Nora kept above the register that she had installed after a register robbery 8 years ago and had never taken down the phone she had used to call the non-emergency line. The two truckers who had both fully turned from their plates now and were watching the room with the watchful neutrality of men who had not yet decided whether this was their business and were leaning toward deciding it was. He said to Sarah still quietly, still without looking at her directly, "Did you bring everything you need with you tonight?" She said, "I have the bag." He said, "Is there anything in the bag the deputy should see?" She went still. Not the stillness of someone who had nothing to say, the stillness of someone standing at the edge of a decision that had been waiting a long time to be made. She said after a moment, "There might be." She reached down between her feet and brought the canvas bag up onto the counter. Her hands moved to the side pocket first, then stopped. Then her hands went to the bottom of the bag, instead finding the seam along the interior lining, working at it with the particular familiarity of someone who had practiced this, who had reached this exact spot before in the dark and known exactly where the loose stitching began. Rex watched without watching. Her fingers pulled back a section of lining to reveal a small interior pocket that was not part of the bag's original construction. It had been added by hand, the stitching close and careful, and made in thread that nearly matched but not quite the way a person sewed who was doing it with urgency and love rather than craft. Inside the pocket was a small object wrapped in a piece of plastic cut from a sandwich bag. Sarah held it in her palm. A micro SD card the size of a thumbnail, old, the kind that fit older phones and older cameras. She said almost to herself, "My mother put it there. Before she went into the hospital the last time, she told me to keep the bag safe. She said if I ever found someone who would actually listen, I should give it to them." Rex looked at it. He said, "Your mother knew." Sarah said, "She spent 63 years watching carefully and saying very little. She decided that was not enough anymore. She had more years of watching than I wanted to believe, and she used every one of them." Outside headlights swept through the parking lot. The patrol car from Harlow's sheriff's substation had arrived at single amber light bar pulsing without the siren, because Nora had been clear on the phone that quiet was preferable. Derek Voss set down his coffee mug. For one fraction of a second in the reflection of the window, Rex watched the man's face lose the performance it had been wearing since he walked in, just for a fraction, just long enough to see what was underneath the warm concern, in the careful speech, in the reasonable voice. It was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Rex looked away from the reflection and back at his stew. The patrol car's door opened in the parking lot. A figure in uniform came toward the diner entrance, one hand touching the brim of their hat against the rain. Sarah curled her fingers around the SD card in her palm. She looked at Rex. He said, "You do not have to say everything tonight. You do not have to be brave in any particular way. You just have to let the people who can help you do their job." She said, "He is very good at making people believe him." Rex said, "He was." He paused, past tense. She looked at him. He said, "You just changed the terms." The diner door opened, and Deputy Karen Sloan stepped in from the rain, her hat dark with water, her eyes moving across the room in the efficient, practiced sweep of someone who had answered late-night calls in small towns long enough to read a room on entry. She took in the bikers, the woman at the counter, the well-dressed man 2 stools down, Nora behind the register, the truckers turned sideways on their stools. She said, "Who called?" Nora raised her hand. The deputy walked toward the counter, her boots steady on the pale-worn tile. Sarah looked at the small card in her palm one more time. Then she turned toward the deputy, and she sat up straight on her stool the way a person sat when they had decided that the long time of staying small was finished. She said, my friend called for me. My name is Sarah Voss. I've been trying to reach someone official for a long time. I have something you need to hear. Across the counter, Derek Voss sat very still, his hands flat on the formica, his jaw set, his eyes doing something careful and cold and calculating behind the warm performance that had stopped working the moment an old biker with a conscience had moved one stool between him and the exit. The rain hit the windows of the Painted Sky diner. The ceiling fan turned. The coffee machine behind the counter made its low working sound. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Sarah Voss did not feel like she was the only person in the room on her side. Deputy Karen Sloan was 44 years old and had been with the Ravalli County Sheriff's substation in Harlow for 11 years. She had answered calls in weather like this more times than she could count. Domestics, breakdowns, lost hikers, bar disagreements that spilled into parking lots. She had learned to read rooms the way certain people learn to read weather, by the pressure of it, by the way the air moved, by what was too still and what was trying too hard. She read this room in about 6 seconds. She looked at the woman at the counter. She looked at the man 2 stools down. She looked at Rex Briggs, whom she recognized from prior years of uneventful Friday nights at the Painted Sky, and then at the younger man near the door. She looked at Nora Gallagher, who was standing behind the register with the particular posture of a woman who had already done what needed doing and was now waiting for someone with a badge to catch up. She said to Sarah, "You want to tell me what is going on?" Sarah opened her hand. The SD card sat in her palm, small and ordinary, and carrying whatever it carried. Derek said from 2 stools down, "Officer, I want to be clear that my wife is in a fragile mental state. She has been since her mother passed 8 months ago. She has been under psychiatric care. I have documentation." He reached into his jacket. He produced a folded set of papers with the smooth efficiency of a man who had prepared for exactly this moment. He held them out to Sloan. Sloan took them. She did not read them yet. She looked at Sarah first. She said, "Is that true? Have you been receiving psychiatric care?" Sarah said, "He arranged for that care. He chose the doctor. He drove me to the appointments, and he waited in the parking lot, and he spoke to the doctor before and after each session. I was not allowed to speak to that doctor alone." Not once. Sloan absorbed this without expression. Derek said, "That is not accurate. I was supportive. There is a difference between being a supportive spouse and exercising control. Sarah has a pattern of reframing support as coercion when she is in an episode." The word episode was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Rex heard it. Nora heard it. Cole heard it from his stool near the door where he had been sitting very quietly, with his hands visible and his eyes moving. Sarah said, "The doctor's name is on those papers. His clinic is in Denver. If you call the clinic directly and ask to speak to anyone on staff other than Dr. Farrow, ask them how many of his patients are wives of men who refer them, you will find a pattern." This was not the speech of a woman in an episode. This was precise. This was organized. Sloan registered that. She set the papers on the counter, not giving them back to Derek, not formally entering them into anything, yet just setting them where she could return to them. She said to Sarah, "Tell me about what is on that card." Sarah looked at it in her palm for a moment. She said, "My mother's name was Diane Voss. She was 63 years old. She died 8 months ago from a cardiac event while she was a patient at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Denver. Before she went in for what we thought was a routine procedure, she came to see me. Derek was not home. She had maybe 40 minutes. She had this card with her. She had been carrying it for a year without telling me." She paused. She said, "My mother was a quiet woman. She watched Derek for 3 years while I made excuses for him, and she watched what happened to me during those 3 years. And she did what a woman of her generation did when she believed something was true and knew no one would listen to her say it out loud. She documented it. She built a record. She used a small camera she bought at a pawn shop in Aurora, and she hid it in the guest room where she stayed when she visited, and she recorded conversations she was present for that I do not fully remember because I have spent 3 years learning to stop remembering things that were too hard to carry." The room was very quiet. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. Sloan said, "What is on the recording?" Sarah said, "I do not know exactly. I have not been able to play it. I have not had a device to play it on, and I have not been in a safe enough place to try. But my mother told me before she went into surgery that it was enough. She said, 'This is enough, Sarah. Keep it safe until you find someone who will listen all the way to the end without letting him talk over it.'" She looked at Sloan. She said, "I am asking you to be that person." Sloan looked at the card. She looked at Derek. She looked at Rex. She looked at Nora. She looked back at Sarah. She said, "I am going to need a device that can read this." She looked at Nora. "You have a laptop behind the counter." Nora said, "I have a tablet." Sloan said, "Does it have a card slot or an adapter?" Nora disappeared into the kitchen for 30 seconds and came back with a small card reader on a cable, the kind used for offloading photos. She plugged it into the tablet and set it on the counter. Derek said, "I have to object to this. Whatever is on that card was obtained without my knowledge or consent. It is inadmissible. It has no legal standing." Sloan said, "I am not a judge. I am a deputy responding to a welfare call in a diner at 11 o'clock at night. I will make my own assessment of what I am looking at." Derek said, "I would like to speak to my attorney before this goes any further." Sloan said, "You are welcome to make that call." She looked at Cole. "Sir, would you mind staying near the door while I conduct this conversation?" "Not blocking it, just near it." Cole said, "Yes, ma'am." He had not moved from his stool. He did not need to. His presence near the door was sufficient geometry. Sarah placed the card into the reader with steady hands. It took 3 tries for the tablet to recognize. The card was old, and the connection was finicky, and each failed attempt made the room hold its breath tighter. On the 4th try, the tablet opened a file browser showing one folder dated 13 months ago, and inside the folder, 7 video files. The largest one was labeled with a date in the single word kitchen. Sarah touched the screen. The video began. It was shot from a low angle, slightly tilted, the unmistakable framing of a hidden camera placed inside something on a shelf. The room it showed was a kitchen, modern and well-appointed granite countertops, and pendant, lighting the kitchen of a home that cost a great deal of money. The timestamp in the corner read 9:47 p.m. 2 people were in this kitchen. One was Sarah, younger looking than now by 3 years, her hair longer, her posture different, smaller, more careful, the posture of someone who had already been learning to take up less space. The other was Derek Voss. He was not hitting her. There was nothing in the video that any police report from that era would have recorded as an incident. What he was doing was harder to name and easier to survive for years without naming, because it had no bruise and left no mark that anyone looking from outside could point to. He was standing at the kitchen island speaking to her in a voice too low for the audio to catch clearly, and she was standing at the counter with her back partly turned, and as he spoke, something happened to her body that was entirely visible, even at the angle and quality of a hidden shelf camera. She got smaller, not physically, but in every way that a person occupied a room in the reach of her shoulders and the angle of her spine, and the way her hands stopped moving and came to rest against her sides like things she had been told not to trust. And then he crossed the kitchen, and he stood behind her close, and he said something directly into the back of her head, and her eyes closed. Nobody in the Painted Sky diner made a sound. Sloan watched the screen. She did not look away. Her face was professional and still, but her jaw had moved once. Rex looked at the surface of the counter in front of him. He did not watch the screen. He did not need to watch the screen. He had seen what he needed to see in the first 10 seconds. Nora pressed her fingers flat against her apron and looked at the tile floor and breathed through her nose. Derek said, "That video is taken entirely out of context." Nobody answered him. There were 6 more files. Sloan watched portions of 4 of them before she straightened up from the tablet and looked at Derek Voss with an expression that had finished being neutral. She said, "Mr. Voss, I am going to ask you to wait in my patrol vehicle while I make some calls." Derek said, "I am not obligated to do that." Sloan said, "You are right." She paused. "But the alternative is that I ask you to wait here while I make those same calls, and I will need to ask these gentlemen to stay as well, and that waiting could take some time, and I suspect you would prefer the vehicle." Derek understood what was underneath this. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Sarah. He said very quietly, "You do not understand what you have done." Rex moved. Not dramatically, not with any sound or announcement, He simply stood up from his stool and placed himself between the counter where Sarah was sitting and the space where Derek was standing, and he was large enough and still enough that the movement did not look like aggression. It looked like weather, like something that had always been there and simply revealed itself. Derek looked at him. Rex said nothing. He met the man's eyes and held them, and his face carried the particular expression of a man who was not afraid of whatever Derek Voss was calculating. Derek looked away first. He walked toward the door. Cole stood from his stool and moved aside to let him pass, a deliberate, unhurried courtesy that was also clearly a statement about who was choosing to let whom move freely. Derek pushed the door open and walked out into the rain toward the patrol car, and the bell above the door gave its bright sound and the room breathed. Sarah's hands were shaking, not the controlled internal trembling from before. Real shaking, the kind that came when a body finally released something it had been holding for a very long time. Nora came around the counter. She did not ask. She put a hand on Sarah's back between her shoulder blades, flat and warm and steady, and she kept it there. Rex sat back down on his stool. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. Sarah said, "He has money. He has relationships with people in the system in Denver. He has done this before, which means he has practice at making people who tell the truth about him look like the problem." Rex set the mug down. He said, "We need to make a call." Cole was already looking at him. Rex said, "Get Donovan on the phone." Cole said, "At this hour." Rex said he will answer. Cole pulled out his phone and stepped toward the far end of the counter. He dialed and turned slightly away and spoke in a low voice, the particular efficient shorthand of people who had worked together long enough that context could be assumed. Donovan was the club's attorney. His name was Arthur Donovan, and he was 61 years old and had been practicing law in Missoula for 33 years, the last 18 of them also handling the legal matters of Iron Verdict MC. He was not a biker. He was a small, precise man who wore vests under his suit jackets and drank tea instead of coffee, and had a reputation for being exceptionally difficult to rattle. Rex had trusted him completely for 18 years, which was a longer unbroken record of trust than he had with almost anyone else alive. Cole handed the phone to Rex. Rex said, "Art, I am at the Painted Sky in Harlow. I need you to listen." He spoke for 3 minutes. He was specific and brief, and he did not editorialize. When he finished, there was a silence on the line while Donovan thought. Then Donovan said, "The SD card needs to be secured as evidence before it leaves that diner. Do not let the deputy put it in her pocket and drive away with it as an informal exhibit. Make sure there is a chain of custody established in writing tonight with a copy given to the woman holding it." Rex said, "Say that again slower." Donovan said it again slower. Rex repeated each step back to Cole, who wrote it on a napkin with the pen that had started the whole night. Donovan said, "I can be in Harlow by 8 tomorrow morning." Rex said, "I will call you at 7. He handed the phone back to Cole. He turned to Sloan, who had come back inside from making her own calls on her radio. Her hat still damp, her expression settled into something more serious than it had been when she walked in. He said, "The card needs a written chain of custody before it leaves this building." He explained what Donovan had said. Sloan looked at him for a moment. She said, "You are right." She said it without resistance, the way competent people acknowledge useful information regardless of where it came from. She produced a small notepad from her breast pocket and wrote on it and asked Sarah to sign it and had Nora sign it as a witness and tore off the copy and gave it to Sarah. Outside, a second vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Not a police vehicle, a dark truck, standard cab, Montana plates. It parked at the edge of the lot and its headlights died, but nobody got out. Cole said quietly from his stool, "That is the second vehicle from the service road." Sloan had already seen it. She picked up her radio. Rex did not look at the truck. He looked at Sarah. He said, "Is there anything else in the bag?" She looked at him. He said, "Your mother put something in the lining of the bag. Is there anything else she did? Anything she told you or gave you or sent you that you have not shown anyone?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is a letter in the front pocket, in an envelope, de Malmo." Rex said, "Who is it addressed to?" She said, "It is addressed to me." But the last thing she said to me, before they took her into surgery, was, "If the card is not enough, open the letter." She said she wrote down everything she remembered hearing with dates, with her own handwriting, signed and notarized before she went in. She found a notary at a UPS store in Aurora the morning before the procedure. Nora made a small sound and pressed her fingers against her mouth. Rex said, "Your mother was a thorough woman." Sarah said, "She spent 63 years watching carefully and saying very little. She decided that was not enough anymore." There was a weight to that sentence that settled over the diner like something true, finally given room to stand. Not grief exactly, closer to recognition. Sloan came back from the door where she had been speaking on her radio. She said, "I have another unit en route. I have also reached the on-call supervisor for the County Family Services line because this involves a child, and I am required to flag that." She looked at Sarah. "Your daughter is currently safe with the neighbor in Billings." Sarah said yes. Sloan said, "I am going to need her contact information." Sarah recited the name and number from memory with the precision of someone who had repeated it to herself every night for 4 days as a kind of prayer. Sloan wrote it down. The second unit arrived 6 minutes later. 2 deputies. They pulled the dark truck and found a man inside who produced a private investigator's license from a firm based in Denver. He had been hired to locate and observe. Nothing in his documentation was technically illegal. But his presence established the infrastructure of what Derek had assembled: the attorney's paperwork, the psychiatric documentation, the private investigator. All of it prepared, all of it coordinated the architecture of a man who had anticipated that this day would eventually come and had spent considerable resources making sure he arrived to it better equipped than she did. Rex sat at the counter and turned this architecture over in his mind, the way he turned mechanical problems over, looking for where the load was carried, where the weakness lived. Derek's structure depended on Sarah appearing unstable. It depended on her being alone. It depended on no independent witness having heard her speak clearly and coherently and with documented evidence before Derek had a chance to establish the frame. That window had closed at approximately 11:13 p.m. when Sarah Voss slid a napkin across a diner counter. Donovan arrived at 7:48 the next morning, and not 8:48, because Arthur Donovan had left Missoula at 5:30 and driven through the tail end of the storm in the dark in his sensible gray sedan and walked into the Painted Sky Diner with his briefcase and his vest and his reading glasses and asked Nora for tea. He sat with Sarah for 2 hours. He read the notarized letter. He reviewed the SD card files on Nora's tablet with his reading glasses on and his face doing nothing dramatic. He asked questions that were specific and sequential and that built upon each other with the logic of someone constructing something durable. At the end, he took his glasses off and set them on the table. He said, "I want to be honest with you about where we are. What you have is significant. It is not nothing. It is the opposite of nothing. But Derek Voss has resources, and those resources buy time and delay is itself a weapon when the person fighting has less endurance than money. I want you to know that before we go further so that you are making a clear-eyed decision." Sarah said, "I have been making clear-eyed decisions for 8 months with no money and no phone and no safe place to sleep more than 2 nights in a row. I am not afraid of the long version of this." Donovan looked at her for a moment. He closed his briefcase. He said, "Good. Then let me tell you what we are going to do." Rex was sitting at the other end of the counter during this conversation, not listening, or rather not inserting himself. He was on his second cup of coffee, and he had been on his phone for the last 40 minutes, not talking, reading. He had pulled up every public record he could find on Derek Voss: property records, business filings, court records. Not from any database he had special access to, just the kind of thing that existed publicly and that most people did not think to look for, because most people assumed that if something bad were easily findable, it would already have been found. He found 3 civil suits filed in the last 6 years, all settled out of court, all with non-disclosure agreements as a condition of settlement. The names of the plaintiffs were sealed. The cases had been filed in 3 different jurisdictions. He could not read the sealed portions, but the pattern of them, the geography, the timing, the speed of the settlements told a story that did not need its details to be legible. He set his phone face down on the counter. Cole came in from outside where he had been making calls of his own. He sat beside Rex and spoke low. He said, "I talked to Graves. He has a contact in the administrative offices at St. Catherine's in Denver. The contact says that Dr. Farrow has had 3 patient complaints filed against him in the last 4 years with the Colorado Medical Board. All 3 complainants were female. All 3 cases were closed without action. The closure documentation on two of them has the same co-signatory, a board member who plays golf every other Saturday with Derek Voss at a club in Cherry Hills Village. Rex said, "You got all of that before 8 in the morning." Cole said Graves is motivated. Rex said, "How many are coming?" Cole said, "However many you want." Rex said, "Nobody comes unless I say so. And if they come, it is quiet. It is professional. It is exactly what the situation calls for and nothing extra. Nobody is a hero. Nobody makes a scene. Are we clear?" Cole said, "We are clear." Rex said, "Tell Graves thank you. Tell him to send me everything in writing on a clean email." Cole sent the text. Outside the painted sky, the storm had moved east overnight and left behind the particular clarity that followed heavy weather in Montana, the air sharp and transparent, the mountains showing themselves fully against a sky that had decided to be generous. The parking lot had dried except for the low spots where water pooled around the painted lines. Sarah came out of the booth where she had been sitting with Donovan and walked to the counter and asked Nora for more coffee. She sat down on the stool she had occupied last night, the same one, and wrapped her hands around the mug. She said to Rex, "He told me it is going to be a process." Rex said most true things are. She said he thinks the recordings, the letter, and the medical board pattern are enough to open a formal investigation. Not enough to guarantee anything, but enough to open the door. Rex said doors are what matter. What comes through them comes later. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Why are you doing this?" She paused. "I mean that as a genuine question, not as doubt. I am genuinely asking." Rex set his mug down. He said, "I had a wife. Her name was Margaret. She was a good woman, patient in ways I did not deserve, funny in a quiet way that most people missed. She asked me once if I thought she was worth protecting, and I said something careless, and I moved on because moving on was easier than meeting the question honestly. She died knowing I had said the careless thing. I did not get to go back and say the other one." He stopped. He said, "What would I have said? She was worth every wall I could have put between her and anything that wanted to hurt her. That is what I would have said. I had years to say it, and I spent them assuming there was more time." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She said, "She knew." Women who love people who have not learned to say the true thing out loud, yet they develop a very accurate sense of the thing anyway. She knew. Rex looked at the counter. He did not argue with her. Nora was behind the counter listening to none of this because she was restocking the condiment station and the pie case, but she was also listening to all of it the way a woman listened when she had made a room her life's work and the room was doing something that mattered. She sliced a fresh piece of apple pie and set it in front of Rex without asking. She set a second piece in front of Sarah. She said, "You both look like you have not eaten in too long." They ate. Outside on Route 12, the first trucks of the morning were beginning to move. The gas station across the road had opened its lights. A school bus made its deliberate way through the intersection at Birch Street and headed north toward the elementary school on the far side of town. Harlow, Montana was beginning its day with no particular awareness that the night before in the diner at the edge of Route 12, a woman had done something that had required 8 months of running and 3 years of endurance and a lifetime of her mother's quiet watching to make possible. She had found someone who listened. And the thing that had been stored in the lining of a canvas bag protected through 7 states and 4 near misses and 1 notarized letter and 1 cardiac ward and 11 months of a woman who loved her daughter more than she feared the consequences of the truth that thing was no longer a secret, held by a frightened person alone in the dark. It was evidence, in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. Derek Voss sat in the county substation 11 miles away, speaking to his attorney on the phone, still calm, still working the angles, still certain that the resources he had assembled would be sufficient to manage this the way he had managed the previous iterations of it. He was certain in the practiced way of someone who had always been certain and had until the previous night always had reason to be. He did not yet know about the notarized letter. He did not yet know about the medical board filings. He did not yet know that a man named Arthur Donovan was sitting in a booth at the Painted Sky Diner with a briefcase full of clear-eyed intention and 33 years of experience making difficult things stick. He knew one thing. He knew that Sarah had found people. And he was only just beginning to understand what that meant. Arthur Donovan filed the first formal motion 6 days after the night at the Painted Sky Diner. He filed it in Ravalli County because that was where the evidence had surfaced and where the initial deputy report had been written, and he filed it with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who had chosen his ground carefully before committing to it. The motion requested an emergency protective order barring Derek Voss from any contact with Sarah Voss, with her daughter June, and with any witnesses connected to the matter. It cited the SD card recordings, the notarized letter, the chain of custody documents signed at the diner counter, and the pattern of civil settlements in 3 separate jurisdictions. Donovan had also sent a formal complaint to the Colorado Medical Board regarding Dr. Farrow, attaching the administrative records Cole had obtained through Graves, the pattern of closed complaints, the co-signatory connection. He sent a copy of that complaint to a journalist at the Denver Post who covered healthcare accountability and who had written about the medical licensing system twice in the previous 3 years. He did not ask the journalist to publish anything. He simply made sure the right person had the right document on their desk. Donovan called Rex on the morning of the 6th day after filing and said the protective order had been granted on an emergency basis pending a full hearing. Rex was in his garage in Harlow, reassembling the carburetor on a 1978 shovelhead that belonged to a man in Stevensville. He had the phone on speaker on the workbench. He said, "What does that mean in plain terms?" Donovan said, "It means Derek Voss cannot come within 500 feet of Sarah or June. It means if he tries, he's in contempt of a court order, which changes the entire conversation. It means we have established in the eyes of a judge sufficient credible concern to take this seriously. It is not a conviction. It is not a finding of guilt. It is a door." Rex said, "How is she doing?" Donovan said, "She is doing the thing that people do when they have been in survival mode for a long time and something finally gives. She is exhausted in a way that sleep does not fix immediately. But she is clear. She is present. She is making good decisions." Rex said, "Where is she staying?" Donovan said Nora has given her the room above the diner. Apparently it had been used for storage for 4 years, and Nora spent 2 days cleaning it out. Rex set down the part he was holding and looked at the wall above his workbench, where a photograph was tacked between a calendar and a parts diagram. Margaret, taken at a rest stop somewhere in Wyoming on a trip they had taken in 2003. She was squinting into the sun and laughing at something behind the camera, and she looked entirely like herself, which was the thing he had loved most about that photograph, that she looked entirely and only like herself. He said, "What does she need?" Donovan said, "Right now she needs the hearing to go the way I believe it will go, and she needs her daughter." Rex said, "When can June come?" Donovan said, "The neighbor in Billings is willing to drive her up this weekend if Sarah says it is safe enough." Rex said, "It is safe enough." He said it with the certainty of a man making a statement about conditions he had assessed himself. June arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a blue Honda driven by a woman named Patricia, who had been Sarah's neighbor in the apartment building in Billings before everything fell apart, who had kept June without asking for explanation or payment, and who hugged Sarah in the parking lot of the Painted Sky for a long time before she got back in the Honda and drove home. June was 7 years old and small for her age, with her mother's gray-green eyes and a serious face that broke open into something luminous when she smiled. She had her mother's canvas bag over one shoulder, packed with the things Patricia had gathered for her, and she was wearing a yellow rain jacket that was slightly too large and rain boots with frogs on them. She walked into the Painted Sky and found her mother at the counter, and the reunion was not dramatic in the way of movies. It was quiet and total. Sarah got down on her knees on the black and white tile floor, and June walked into her arms, and they stayed like that for a while, not moving, not speaking, just present in the specific way of people who had been afraid they might not get to be present again. Nora stood behind the counter and looked at the pie case and blinked several times. Rex was not in the diner when June arrived. He had thought about it and decided his presence was not what that moment needed. He found out later from Cole, who had been there getting coffee, that June had eventually climbed onto a stool and asked Nora if the diner had chocolate milk, and Nora had said they absolutely did, and that had been the beginning of June's relationship with the Painted Sky Diner, which would become one of the steadier things in her life over the months that followed. The full hearing was set for the last Thursday in November, 43 days from the night at the Painted Sky. Donovan spent those weeks building the case with the methodical patience of someone laying a foundation rather than erecting a facade. He deposed Dr. Farrow, whose answers were evasive in the specific way of answers that had been legally coached, but that could not avoid the underlying shape of the truth. He obtained records from the 3 civil cases through a discovery motion that Derek's attorneys fought and lost. The sealed names of the plaintiffs could not be revealed, but the pattern of the cases could be entered into the record. The geography, the timing, the settlement terms, the speed at which Derek's legal team had moved to close each one before it reached any public proceeding. Derek's attorney filed 4 separate motions to have the SD card recordings excluded, each on a different technical ground. Donovan responded to each one. The judge denied all 4. The criminal threshold was not met. Donovan had told her that on the first morning, and she had accepted it because the record itself was the point. What they were building was a civil protection case, one that would establish in a permanent court record what had happened in that marriage. And that record, once established, would make the machinery Derek had built around his reputation very difficult to operate going forward. The journalist at the Denver Post had not yet published anything, but she had made calls. She had spoken to the Colorado Medical Board, to the clerk of court in 2 of the 3 jurisdictions where the civil suits had been filed, and to a source at St. Catherine's who had worked with Diane Voss during her final admission. The journalist was building something too in parallel, in the careful way of someone who wanted to get it right rather than get it first. Sarah knew about the journalist. Donovan had told her. He had also told her that she had no obligation to speak to anyone from the press, and that whatever she decided he would support. Sarah said she would think about it. She thought about it for 10 days. She thought about it while she helped Nora with the morning prep. Learning the rhythm of the diner, the way she had learned the rhythm of waitress work years earlier, her hands remembering before her mind caught up the coffee and the order slips and the particular choreography of a counter and a kitchen working together. She thought about it while she sat with June in the room above the diner in the evenings, helping with second-grade homework and reading aloud and doing the ordinary work of being a mother that she had been denied for 8 months. She thought about it one afternoon when Rex came in for his coffee and sat at his usual stool, and she poured for him without asking, because she had learned his habits by then, and he said thank you the way he always said it, brief and genuine. She thought about the other women whose names were sealed in those court records. She called the journalist on a Tuesday morning from the phone in the room above the diner. She talked for 2 hours. She told the truth in the organized, specific way she had learned to tell it, without drama, without embellishment, with the dates and the details and the particular texture of what 3 years inside that marriage had felt like from the inside. The journalist listened all the way to the end without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the journalist was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable person." Sarah said she spent 63 years watching carefully and saying very little. In the end, she decided that was not enough anymore. She did something about it instead. The journalist published her piece 4 days before the hearing. It was careful and factual, and it named Derek Voss, and it named Dr. Farrow, and it named the pattern of civil settlements, and it quoted with permission a portion of Diane Voss's notarized letter. It did not sensationalize. It did not editorialize. It simply laid out what had happened and let the shape of it speak. By the morning of the hearing, the piece had traveled widely. Derek's attorney called Donovan the night before and made it an offer. Donovan took the offer to Sarah. She sat with it for 15 minutes at the counter of the Painted Sky with a cup of coffee in front of her, and June drawing at the corner booth where Nora had set her up with paper and colored pencils. Then she said, "No." Donovan said, "You understand what going forward means. The hearing is public. Everything in the record is public." Sarah said, "I understand." She said, "His offer depends on my silence. His entire operation has always depended on the silence of the people he heard. I am done being silent. Whatever the hearing costs me, I will pay it, but I will not pay it in silence." Donovan looked at her for a moment. He closed his briefcase. He said, "I will see you tomorrow morning." The morning of the hearing, Rex came into the Painted Sky at 6:30, earlier than his usual Friday night. He sat at the counter and drank his coffee and did not say much. Sarah was getting ready in the room upstairs. Nora was making breakfast she would not charge anyone for. Cole was outside on the phone. At 7:15, Cole came back inside. He sat down beside Rex. He said, "They are coming." Rex said, "How many?" Cole said, 47 confirmed, more likely on the road. Rex was quiet for a moment. He said, "Remind them." Quiet, professional, exactly what is called for. Nothing extra. Cole said, "They know." Rex said, "Say it anyway." Cole sent the text. The Ravalli County Courthouse in Hamilton was a 40-minute drive from Harlow on a dry morning. It was a modest building, brick and practical, sitting on a corner 2 blocks from the main street with a parking lot on the south side and a row of cottonwood trees along the front that had gone to their full autumn gold. By 8:45, the parking lot was full. Not of court personnel or press or Derek Voss's legal team in their rental cars from Missoula Airport. The parking lot was full of motorcycles. They were parked in clean, even rows the way disciplined people parked, leaving the access lanes clear, leaving the handicap spaces clear, leaving room for the court vehicles near the entrance. 47 bikes. Iron verdict patches predominant, but not exclusively. There were men from 2 other chapters who had driven through the night from Butte and from Great Falls. There were independent riders Rex had known for years, who had heard through the particular informal network that such news traveled and had decided to come. They were not there to intimidate. They were not there to demonstrate power. They were standing or sitting on their bikes or leaning against their bikes, drinking coffee from gas station cups, talking in low voices, watching the entrance to the courthouse parking lot with the patient attention of men who had nowhere else to be and had decided that here was where they belonged this morning. When Sarah arrived in Donovan's gray sedan with June in the back seat, she did not see them at first because Donovan had come in through the side street. She saw them when she got out of the car and looked toward the parking lot. She stopped. She stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse entrance and looked at 47 motorcycles arranged in even rows in the October morning light, their riders standing or sitting quietly, and she did not say anything for a long moment. June took her hand. June said, "Mom, who are all those people?" Sarah said, "Those are people who showed up." June looked at them with the frank, evaluating gaze of a 7-year-old assessing something new. She said, "There are a lot of them." Sarah said, "Yes." She found Rex near the end of the second row, standing beside his bike with his coffee, his cut on his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at her when she found him. He did not wave. He did not make any gesture that called attention to itself. He just looked at her with the same steady, unhurried attention he had been giving her since the night she slid a napkin across a diner counter. She walked over to him. She said, "You did not have to do this." He said, "Nobody here had to do anything. That is the point." She looked at the rows of bikes, at the men standing quietly in the morning light, at Cole near the front, hands in pockets, watching the street with the alert stillness she had come to recognize as simply who he was, at a man she did not know who had driven from Great Falls with a crease in his jacket from sleeping in it and who was drinking bad coffee with the particular contentment of someone who believed they were in the right place. She said, "My mother would have liked this." Rex said, "She sounds like a woman with good judgment." Sarah almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had managed in longer than she could accurately measure. She said, "I should go in." Rex said, "We will be here." She took June's hand and walked toward the courthouse entrance with Donovan beside her, and she did not look back, but she did not need to. She could feel the parking lot behind her the way you felt a warm room when you stepped out of cold air. Not dramatically, just present, real. The hearing lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Derek Voss's attorney was skilled, and the motions were well constructed, and Derek himself sat at the defendant's table in a good suit and presented the careful face of a reasonable man caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. He had done this before. He was good at it. But the recordings were in evidence. The notarized letter was in evidence. The pattern of civil settlement stripped of its sealed names but fully present in its shape and timing was in evidence. Dr. Farrow's deposition, evasive and coached as it was, had left a record that Donovan used with quiet precision, reading back answers and noting what they did and did not say, building the architecture of a thing that could not be dismantled by composure alone. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Slid, 60 years old, with the particular gravity of someone who had spent decades in a room where people told conflicting versions of the truth and had developed a very accurate ear for the difference between them. She listened to everything. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table beside Donovan, and she did not look at Derek, and she did not look at the gallery until a moment near the end of the second hour, when Donovan was presenting the final portion of the medical board documentation. She looked back then, briefly, the way a person looks when they feel something behind them. 3 rows back on the left side of the gallery sat a woman Sarah had never seen before. She was perhaps 45, brown-haired, wearing a gray coat, sitting alone, with her hands folded in her lap. She was not a reporter. She had no notebook. She had the particular stillness of someone who had made a significant effort to be present in this room and intended to remain present until it was finished. She met Sarah's eyes. Sarah understood without being told. One of the sealed names from one of the sealed settlements had read the journalist's article 4 days ago. She had driven from Colorado Springs. She had come to sit 3 rows behind a woman she had never met because some debts were paid in presence rather than words, and some forms of solidarity required nothing more and nothing less than being in the room. Sarah turned back to face forward. Her hands were steady on the table. When it was done, Judge Slade did not deliberate long. She issued a permanent protective order. She referred the matter of Dr. Farrow's practice to the Colorado Medical Board with a formal judicial recommendation for review. She entered into the court record a finding that the pattern of conduct documented in the evidence constituted a sustained campaign of psychological and financial coercion. She used the words she could use, and she used them clearly and on the record, and the record was public. Derek Voss left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His attorney spoke briefly to the press on the steps using sentences that contained many words and communicated very little. Derek got into the rental car, and the rental car left the parking lot by the side street away from the rows of motorcycles. Sarah came out of the courthouse into the October light with June's hand in hers and Donovan 1 step behind. She stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked at the parking lot. The 47 bikes were still there. The riders were standing now, facing the entrance, not arranged in any formal way, just present. The way people were present when they had decided that presence was the thing they had to offer, and they were offering it fully. Nobody cheered. Nobody made noise. They just stood there in the morning light and looked at her. June pressed against her mother's side and looked at the rows of bikes and riders and said in her serious, literal voice, "Mom, are those men your friends now?" Sarah looked at them. At Rex near the end of the second row, his hands in his pockets, looking back at her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done something right and did not need to make more of it than it was. She said, "Yes, I think they are." The woman in the gray coat from Colorado Springs came down the courthouse steps and stopped beside Sarah. She did not introduce herself. She did not need to. She looked at Sarah for a moment, and then she put her hand briefly over Sarah's free hand, the one that was not holding June, and she nodded once and she walked to her car. Sarah watched her go. Donovan stood beside her and said nothing because there was nothing useful to add to what had just happened. The months that followed were not simple. The process of unwinding what Derek had built around her life, the financial controls, the legal entanglements, the bureaucratic residue of 3 years inside his system took time and required work that was unglamorous and slow. There were forms and filings and phone calls with offices that put her on hold, and hearings that were continued and rescheduled and continued again. There were mornings when the weight of the still unfinished parts of it settled on her before she got out of bed, and she lay there looking at the ceiling of the room above the painted sky and made herself name 3 things that were different from 8 months ago. June was safe. That was always the first one. She had a place to sleep. That was the second. She was not alone. That was the third. Those 3 things held up every time she tested them. She stayed at the painted sky through the winter. Nora paid her properly, not as a favor but as a wage, because Nora was short-staffed and Sarah was good at the work, quick and organized, and possessed of the particular quality that good diner waitresses had the ability to read what a person needed before they fully knew they needed it. The regulars took to her. Harriet Boone, the retired school teacher with the library books, began coming in 3 mornings a week instead of 2, and brought June a different book each time, selected with the specific care of a former teacher who understood what a child needed to read at exactly this age and in exactly this kind of recovering year. The 2 truckers who had been at the counter the night everything happened became regulars in a new way. The way people became regulars when they had witnessed something that mattered and wanted to be near the place where it had happened. They tipped well and said little, and it was enough. Rex came in on Friday nights. Same stool, same order. Black coffee, beef stew when it was on apple pie after. The pattern did not change, and Sarah did not try to change it. She poured his coffee without asking. He said thank you the way he always said it. They talked sometimes and did not talk other times, and both modes were comfortable in the way that comfort was when it was built on something real rather than performance. June turned 8 in February in the middle of a cold snap that frosted the diner windows and kept Route 12 down to one careful lane. Nora made a cake from scratch 3 layers with buttercream frosting and 8 candles and set it on the counter with the particular ceremony of someone who had not had a child's birthday in her diner for a long time and was finding that she had missed it. Cole arrived that evening with a present wrapped in newspaper, which was either charming or evidence of limited preparation, and it turned out to be a small illustrated atlas of the United States with every state's birds and animals and landmarks. June opened it immediately and began reading at the counter, turning the pages with the focused joy of a child who had received exactly the right thing. Cole had wrapped it in newspaper because that was the kind of man he was becoming, someone who showed up with the right thing and did not need credit for finding it. Rex arrived at his usual time. He sat at his stool. He looked at the cake. He looked at June, who was deep in the atlas. He reached into the pocket of his coat and put something on the counter near her elbow without interrupting her reading. It was a small compass, brass-oled with a worn patina that said it had been carried and used rather than displayed. The needle swung and settled north with quiet authority. June looked up from the atlas. She looked at the compass. She picked it up and watched the needle. She said, "Does it work?" Rex said, "Every time." June looked at him with the evaluating gaze she had inherited from her mother. She said, "Was it yours?" He said, "It belonged to someone I trusted. Now it belongs to someone I trust." June considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she set the compass on top of the open atlas and went back to reading. Sarah from behind the counter looked at Rex. He was looking at the atlas in June's hands, at the small brass compass sitting on the open page, and his face had the expression of a man who had just placed something he had been carrying for a long time in hands that would take better care of it. She set a piece of birthday cake in front of him without asking. He ate it, and that was its own kind of language. Spring came to Harlow the way it always came to that part of Montana, tentatively with reversals. A warm week followed by a late frost, the cottonwoods along the courthouse street budding, and then waiting, making no permanent commitments until May was certain. Route 12 opened back up fully, and the trucks began moving at volume again, and the painted sky filled each morning with the organized noise of people who had places to be. Sarah had been offered a position at a legal aid office in Missoula, working as a case intake coordinator, a job for which her particular combination of organizational precision and experiential understanding made her unusually well-suited. Donovan had made the introduction. It was a real job with a salary and benefits, and it was 50 miles from Harlow. She sat with the offer for a week. She sat with it at the counter in the mornings before the diner opened, and she sat with it in the room upstairs in the evenings after June was asleep, turning it over the way you turned something over when you knew what you wanted to do and were making sure the knowing was genuine. She told Nora first. Nora said, "Of course you should take it." Sarah said, "I do not want to leave you short-staffed." Nora said, "I have been short-staffed for 19 years. I know how to manage it." She said, "This place gave me something I did not know I needed. I want you to know that." Nora said, "You gave this place something too." She paused. "You reminded me why I bought it." They stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet for a moment. Then Nora handed her a coffee and turned back to the prep work, and that was the end of the sentiment, which was exactly the right amount. Sarah told Rex on a Friday night 2 weeks before she was due to start the new job. He listened. He nodded. He said, "Missoula is a good city." She said, 50 miles is not very far." He said, "No, it is not." She said, "June wants to come back for her birthday next February. She has already told Nora." Rex said Nora will make the 3-layer cake again. Sarah said she will make it bigger. Rex looked at the counter for a moment. He said, "You did a hard thing, not just that night at the diner, the whole thing, all of it. That was hard and you did it right." Sarah looked at the counter. She said, "I had help." He said, "You knew how to use the help. That is the part that was yours." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, the way he looked at things he felt more than he had words for, steady and inward, the particular expression of a man who had learned to sit with what he could not change and act on what he could. She reached across the counter and put her hand over his, briefly the way you touched something solid when you wanted to acknowledge it without making more of it than it was. He did not pull away. He looked at her hand and then at the window, and he nodded once the way he nodded when something was true and sufficient and did not need to be added to. She moved her hand. She picked up the coffee pot. She said, "You want a piece of pie?" He said, "I always want a piece of pie." She cut him a slice and set it down, and they sat in the warm noise of the painted sky on a Friday night, the counter and the stools and the ceiling fan turning, and the windows showing the dark, and the lit sign buzzing softly in the wind off the mountains, and the ordinary work of an ordinary evening continued around them. On the last morning before she left for Missoula, Sarah came downstairs at 5:30 while the diner was still dark and unlocked the front door and turned on the lights the way Nora had taught her, the sequence of them from back to front, the coffee machine first, then the counter lights, then the window sign last, so that anyone on Route 12 in the early dark could see the painted sky open and lit and available, which was what a diner was for. She made the first pot of coffee. She sat at the counter on the second stool from the register. Her stool. She wrapped her hands around a mug and looked at the diner around her, at the worn tile and the booths and the pie case, and the camera above the register that had been there since before she arrived and would be there after she left. She thought about a woman sitting at a kitchen table in Aurora, Colorado with a hidden camera and a pawn shop microcard, and the particular courage of a person who had been watching carefully for a very long time and had finally decided to do something about what she saw. She thought about what it had cost her mother to do that quietly alone without knowing if it would ever matter, without knowing if Sarah would ever find the right moment or the right room or the right person to hand it to. She thought about a napkin on a diner counter and the 4 words written in response. How many exits does he know about? She pulled a napkin from the dispenser on the counter. She smoothed it flat. She took the pen from her jacket pocket and she wrote on it, not urgently, not with the compressed necessity of that first night, but with the deliberate intention of someone completing something that mattered. She wrote, "If you need to write it down instead of say it, we will read it." She walked to the wall beside the register, below the camera, beside the coffee pot where people stood when they were paying and where eyes naturally went. She found a piece of tape in the drawer under the register. She taped the napkin to the wall. She stood back and looked at it. It was slightly crooked. She straightened it. She went back to her stool. She drank her coffee. 40 minutes later, Nora came downstairs in her apron with her hair in its practical knot and stopped when she saw the napkin on the wall. She stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then she went to the coffee machine and poured herself a mug and sat down on the stool beside Sarah, and they both looked at the napkin on the wall and did not say anything because some things were said well enough the first time and did not need to be repeated. The door opened at 6:15, and the first trucker of the morning Ben came in from the cold, stamping his boots on the mat, and Nora stood up and reached for the coffee pot, and the Painted Sky Diner began its day. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in early autumn, a woman came through the door of the Painted Sky just before the breakfast rush ended. She was perhaps 30, wearing a jacket that did not quite fit, carrying a bag pressed close to her side. She did not look at the other customers. She looked at the exits first, then the window, then the counter. She sat down on the second stool from the register. The woman behind the counter came over with the coffee pot. The woman in the too large jacket looked at the napkin on the wall beside the register. She read it once. She read it again. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out a pen. She picked up a napkin from the dispenser and she smoothed it flat on the counter with one careful hand. She began to write. Sarah Voss set down the coffee pot. She looked at the napkin moving slowly across the counter toward her. She looked at the woman's hand, at the careful small letters, at the way the writing was controlled and contained the way writing was when a person had learned to keep things small. She put both hands flat on the counter open where they could be seen. She waited. She read every word.